Honourable members will know that this is a private member's bill, and so I want to start by putting on record my thanks to the government and to the Minister here today for giving it government time and for their efforts more broadly to help tackle the scourge of FGM and to protect those at risk of FGM. The bill has passed through the other place. It received cross-party support in its second reading committee, sitting a fortnight ago, and again last week in the Public Bill Committee. And I also will take this opportunity to put on the record my thanks to the Honourable Member for Ashfield for the words that she spoke during that session and for the cross-party nature in which this issue was tackled. The bill was initiated by crossbench peer Lord Berkeley, who became aware of an omission in existing child protection law where family courts do not have the power to compel the involvement of a local authority in an interim care order relating to FGM. So he decided to act, and he piloted this simple two-clause bill through the other place with passion, clarity and decency, and I'm grateful to him. It's been my pleasure to work with the government to attempt to get the bill through this place, and notwithstanding one or two hurdles earlier on. And I want to place on the record my thanks also to FGM survivor and extraordinarily effective campaigner Nimco Ali. And Nimco will be known to many people in this place. She is probably this country's best known FGM campaigner, and she's used absolutely every opportunity at her disposal to press the issue right to the top of the political agenda. And it was wonderful only 3 days ago to see on Twitter a picture of her standing in number 10 next to the Prime Minister, where she literally has taken this issue to the very heart of government. Her work has extended well beyond what she has achieved in this country. She famously persuaded all the contenders in the 2017 Somaliland presidential election to commit to legislating against FGM. And I remember as she went out to Somaliland, I don't think that many people imagined that she had the slightest chance of succeeding, but she did. All three contenders made the pledge. The election was won by President Musa, and good to his word, he introduced the legislation as soon as he took office. Incidentally, the election itself was a model election. It was the first in the world, I believe, where iris technology was used as a means of avoiding any electoral fraud. And you had this extraordinary scene in one of the most troubled parts of the planet where the contenders shook hands and accepted the result with any fuss whatsoever. It's something perhaps we could learn as we discuss ongoing problems with Brexit. I will certainly go away.
I'm very grateful. Can I commend my honourable friend for the work he's done on this? Given Nimco Ali's great powers of persuasion and advocacy, maybe a role in the whip's office might be of use as we approach difficult times.
Yeah, my honourable friend makes a very good point. She is effectively my whip. Most of what I'm doing in this place in relation to FGM is down to her wagging finger, telling me exactly what to do and what not to do. Someone described me at a recent event I did with her as Nimco's intern. But it's a great honour to be her intern. She's an extraordinary campaigner, and if I can help her in any way, then it is an honour to do so. Honourable members will be familiar with the horrors of FGM, but I do think they bear repeating, just to remind us why this issue matters so much and why it should matter to everyone in this place. According to the World Health Organization, female genital mutilation includes, quote, all procedures that involve partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. And it is almost always carried out on very young children, rarely by medical professionals, rarely with pain relief, and it has absolutely no... Yes, please.
I'm not sure if this is the case, but I'm sure in the information I was reading, when my honourable friend says on very young people, it can be carried out in some cases very soon after birth. Has he heard that?
He's absolutely right. The average age, I believe, is 5. And given that 5 is the average, that would imply that girls at a very, very young age are subjected to FGM. And I was going to say that this is a practice that has absolutely no basis whatsoever in medicine. I give way.
I'm grateful to the objective of giving way. I mean, FGM is just completely shocking. It's not something I actually knew anything about until a couple of years ago when it was being raised up the political spectrum. I mean, for me, we talked in this House recently about sex and relationships education. Is FGM going to be a central part of that so people are educated in the country about what's actually happening?
But my honourable friend raises a really important point, and had we been having this debate 2 weeks ago, I would have said I hope so. But I don't know. But we have subsequently had announcements. In fact, I think we had announcements on the day of our committee from the Department for the Environment, for Education, apologies, where that this is exactly what was going to happen, that education would be introduced at the appropriate level so that children, boys and girls, know that FGM is a practice that we absolutely should not be tolerating. I mention it has no basis. Yes, please.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He describes the horrors of FGM very vividly. Does he agree with me that actually, in a way, it's a form of child abuse as well?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more vehemently with my honourable friend. It's not just a kind of child abuse, it is child abuse, by any definition, by any metrics. I said earlier that it has no basis whatsoever in medicine, but nor, despite what we are sometimes, despite what we're often told, does it have any basis whatsoever in any religion. The practice is often, and you'll see this on social media particularly, it's often wrongly blamed on Islam, both by extremists wanting to justify and in some cases even advocate FGM, but also by others wishing to use FGM as a stick with which to bash the religion itself. In fact, the practice predates Islam, and the Quran neither advocates nor justifies it in any way at all. The consequences of FGM can be really extreme. It can lead to severe pain, excessive bleeding, infection, menstrual problems, pain during sex and childbirth, deep psychological and long-lasting trauma. In fact, these effects of FGM can and often do last for the duration of the person's life. And it's estimated that around the world, at least 200 million women and girls alive today have undergone FGM. And in England and Wales, shockingly, the figure is around 137,000, although, of course, not all of them had FGM, were subjected to FGM in either England or Wales. I do want to make this point, and I apologise for those with a sensitive nature, but at a recent urgent question on this issue, when the bill had been blocked by the Honourable Member for Christchurch, there was an urgent question the following day or a couple of days later. And during that urgent question, a number of colleagues raised concerns about male circumcision, as if there was some kind of comparison between the two. Well, whatever your views on male circumcision, I think it must be obvious that it doesn't compare with FGM. The male equivalent of FGM wouldn't be circumcision. It would be the removal of the entire head of the penis and much of the shaft as well. Yes, please.
Thank you. We often hear this argument about comparing the two, but male circumcision, in my experience, is rarely, if ever, done to subjugate the boy, whereas this is very clearly done to end the sexual pleasure for women.
She makes exactly the right point, and I thank her very much for her intervention. And I think it's also worth saying that were a culture to experiment with such an extreme form of male circumcision on a comparative level to what young girls are experiencing around the world, I suspect it wouldn't last more than a single generation, and it certainly wouldn't require legislation and a campaign of the sort that Nimco Ali and her colleagues have waged. I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree that the horrendous abuse of the kind that he is talking about, the lifelong effects that result from it, cannot possibly be justified on the basis of cultural practice?
I couldn't agree more strongly, and in fact, partly on the instruction of Nimco Ali, referring to my earlier comments, I am a co-chair of the all-party group on FGM. And early on, when we established it, we took evidence from a very wide group of people, all of whom had been through FGM themselves, to different degrees of FGM. All of them had been through FGM, and it was very clear, talking to them, that their lives have been, in many respects, defined by what they went through. All of them committed to campaigning to stamp out this practice, and none of them would have any truck whatsoever with the argument that this is a cultural practice and it would be insensitive for the British Parliament, for example, to try to legislate against, or for Department for International Development to commit funds to trying to prevent the practice. I do.
I'd like to thank him for giving way and for the huge amount of leadership he's shown on addressing this hideous, hideous crime. Does he agree with me that this is a very busy night in British politics, but the fact that there are so many of us present this evening is a real sign that this House says every single action must be taken to rule out this crime in our country?
I couldn't agree more, and I'm very grateful to colleagues for for being here today to take part in this debate. And I don't want to jinx it, but I imagine, I certainly hope, that this simple bill will go through without a division, which makes the presence of so many people here today even more valued. As it happens, this does need to be said, the anti-FGM legislation in the UK is not insubstantial. And we've actually done a fair bit. It's been illegal here since the 1985 Prohibition of Female Circumcision Act. That was replaced by the 2003 Female Genital Mutilation Act, which made it illegal to assist someone performing FGM or to commit FGM abroad. Then in 2015, the Serious Crime Act amended the 2003 Act and introduced mandatory reporting of FGM and created the FGM protection orders, which courts can issue to protect girls who have been or may be victims of FGM. And that could include, for example, forcing the surrender of a passport to prevent travel abroad. And in addition to those laws that we have here, we've taken a lead globally, and I think that is something that we can all collectively be very proud of. The UK was the first country in the world to create a dedicated anti-FGM aid programme with an initial tranche of £35 million, which was pledged in 2013. And only a few weeks ago, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Department for International Development, committed a further additional £50 million, which is yet to be allocated, but which is there for one purpose, and that is helping countries around the world, but mostly in Africa. I do give way.
I thank him very much for giving way, and he's absolutely right to emphasise the international nature, but does he also agree that the government has committed millions of pounds worth, I think it's £100 million of the funding, to the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy in this country as well? We must ramp up these efforts, though.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm glad she made that point, and I'm grateful to her for doing so. I mean, this is a form of extreme violence, of course, against women and girls, and very much part of the same. Is my honourable friend asking me to give way? I certainly do.
On the issue that he's raised of young girls being taken abroad to go through the horrific experience of FGM, did he see the article by campaigner Layla Hussein in the Sunday Times over the weekend, describing what happened to her, I think, aged 7, and what an extraordinary, powerful article that is? Is it something that he thinks could be shared widely amongst other parliamentarians?
I thank him for bringing that to our attention. I know her, Layla, relatively well. In fact, she was one of the first people to give evidence to the all-party group, and we've had meetings subsequently. I haven't actually read the article that he's described, but I can imagine how powerful it must be, given the experience that she has been through, and given her own advocacy on this issue. She's an extraordinarily powerful campaigner as well. I do.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and absolutely congratulate him on the work he's done and his government. But does he agree with me that there is still work to do by the Home Office in having a joined-up approach? I had a constituent, Lola Ilisami, whose case I raised on the floor of this House. Her daughter was under threat of FGM because her violent ex-partner was trying to coerce her into going back to Nigeria to have her daughter cut, and the UK government were unwilling to give her leave to remain. She's had her stay extended, but she still doesn't have indefinite leave to remain, and there is still a threat over her daughter. Does he agree with me? More joined-up working is still required.
I thank her for her intervention. I certainly do agree with her. I mean, this is a cross-cutting issue. An honourable friend earlier suggested that this should form part of HSE in this country, which it now will. But it's a Home Office issue as well. It's a health issue. It covers really a lot of different departments. But I would say to the honourable member that if there's anything at all I or the APG and my colleagues on the APG can do to help in the case that she's just raised, I'm absolutely at her service and will do what I can. Despite the laws we have in place, despite the injection of funds that we have put into campaigning against this issue around the world, clearly there are gaps in the law and the problem has not gone away. In the year 2016 to 2017, the NHS reported 9,179 cases of FGM, and of those, 5,391 were newly recorded cases. And as honourable members will know, there has been only one successful prosecution for FGM after numerous failed attempts. In fact, this came to an end last week with a 37-year-old woman being sentenced for 11 years. I do.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he look at the record in France and the approach the French take in dealing with the FGM and the success that they have had as perhaps a source of ideas and that we could follow to help cut down FGM in the UK?
I have, and this is something we have looked at in the APG, and it's something which it's a much more interventionist approach that the French engage in. Inspections, for example, of young girls, and it's something that most of the people who have given evidence to our committee feel would not fit this country, that it would be stepping over a line. However, another area where the French have been more robust than we have in this country has been in trying to identify people at risk. Now, there are certain people who are at risk and other people who are not at risk. If you are someone whose parents or you have not been subjected to FGM, the likelihood of you going on to subject your own child to FGM is very, very small. It's not zero, incidentally, but it's very, very small. Whereas other families where it passes from generation to generation, clearly a newborn girl is at risk. And the French are much more robust, I think, than we have been in this country. Just before I move on, yes, please.
I pay tribute to my honourable friend and his work on this, and of our mutual friend Nim Koali, who has championed this from the start. Would he agree with me that this has very little to do with religious or racial sensitivities and is straight-up child abuse and should be called out as such? And does he similarly welcome the first prosecution of someone for FGM in this country only 2 weeks ago, and the length of the sentence and the deterrent that can mean in some of our communities where some people will feel that actually there's no point reporting this because it won't be prosecuted? Does he agree that the length of that sentence sends a message and is encouraging actually in this fight against FGM?
Yeah, I strongly agree with him. And in fact, I'm going to take this opportunity to quote from the National Police Chiefs Council lead for FGM, Commander Ivan Balhatchik. He said, in response to the conviction, I said, female genital mutilation is a barbaric and violent crime, a violation of human rights, often with lifelong consequences, committed by the people children should be able to trust the most. Today's sentencing will act as a deterrent and a warning that our society will not accept this child abuse, but prosecutions alone, of course, will not solve the problem.
I'm grateful to my old friend for giving way. Does his work in the all-party group and with campaigners reveal a reluctance amongst any groups of people to whom children are presented for whatever reason? We're all very familiar in our constituencies about when a child is discovered to have bruising or possible signs of maltreatment, and that following cases like Victoria Climbié, there's almost a lurch in the other direction to immediately assume that there is a problem of child abuse, but perhaps that hasn't happened enough in this case. Is he confident that legislation like this is going to make it more and more easy for those cases to be presented as child abuse?
I thank him for his intervention. I can't give him a scientific answer, but I can tell him that the evidence we received in the APG from those people who have been through FGM absolutely concurs with what he has just said, that there are parts of the establishment, parts of social services, people within the education system who are very, very nervous indeed about pointing the finger when it concerns FGM. There's a concern of trampling on cultural sensitivities. And their view, and certainly my view, and I suspect the view of many people in the House today, is that those sensitivities should be pushed to one side. This is a very direct form of child abuse, and child abuse is child abuse, and it is our responsibility as adults and the authorities to stamp it out at every opportunity. And that message has been unambiguous from all of the evidence we've taken from those people who've been through FGM. I do.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder how we can convince people that think this barbaric practice is decent, like the families. How do we get to the families? Does the APPG have any answer to how we stop mothers and fathers actually taking their children and allowing this sort of thing to happen?
I thank him for his intervention. I believe, and I don't just believe, I know because the evidence shows that there is a shift that's happening. So I mentioned Nimco Ali's campaign in Somaliland. That is not a campaign where she is having to bash her head against a brick wall. Every member of the newly elected Somaliland government is on board in a mission to eradicate FGM. In fact, if you go to Somaliland now, you will see in Hargeisa, the city, the capital, you'll see huge posters that have been put up and paid for by government, but designed by the campaign groups at the grassroots, telling people that FGM is not only illegal, it is unethical, immoral, and it has no basis whatsoever in religion. I realise I didn't answer my honourable friend's earlier intervention on that point, and it couldn't be clearer. And Nimco is not the only person who's had that kind of electrifying impact in individual countries. We've got Jaha Dukure, who is from Gambia originally, moved to New York, went back to Gambia, and like Nimco, persuaded the government to not only legislate against FGM, but to put resources into those people at the grassroots who are campaigning to change hearts and minds. And by all accounts, she is succeeding on an extraordinary scale. So I'm going to come to this a little bit later when I wrap up, but I do think there is such an important role for the Department for International Development, and I think we can be proud of what we've done, but we've got to make sure that the next raft of money, the 50 million that's been pledged, is spent, is invested in the right groups and the right campaigns. Yes, please.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way one more time. And he mentions the Gambia. A friend of mine was unfortunately forced to move back to the Gambia, having done a lot of work in Scotland on FGM and helping coordinate the FGM strategy in Scotland. She's now set up an NGO called Women in Leadership and Liberation, and she is supporting a young woman called Binta. That is not her real name because we are trying to protect her real name, who was subject of FGM, was raped by an older man, has been subjected to terrible persecution by her own family and been cast out by them, and we are now raising funds trying to get her into a safe house. Does he think that she is the kind of person that we could do more to support and more to reach out to?
I absolutely do, and I would really strongly encourage her to link her friend up with Jaha, who is a very high profile now and significant figure in Gambia, and one of the world's most important FGM campaigners. She was nominated for the Nobel Prize last year. So I'm happy again to talk about that after this session and see if I can do something to link her up with the right people. So clearly there is more to be done, both here and abroad. And this bill that we're here to talk about today is a part of that. Now, I'm not going to pretend that it's going to stop FGM. It won't, but it does provide another potentially crucial legal tool in the fight against it. And I want to explain briefly what it does and why it matters. First, I want to point out that the bill has just 2 clauses. The second clause provides only for the extent of the bill and the commencement and its short title. So I want to focus on the first clause, which is the only substantive clause in this very short bill. At present, the Children Act 1989 allows courts to make an interim care order. That's an instruction to a local authority to share parental responsibility for a child. And these orders can last up to 8 weeks and they can be renewed. But they can do so only if they believe the child in question is suffering or likely to suffer significant harm. The local authority would then be part of any decisions relating to where the child should live or how its welfare should be maintained. Now, I don't think anyone would argue that a girl who has undergone or who is likely to undergo FGM is suffering or likely to suffer significant harm. But at present, the 1989 Children Act does not allow interim care orders to be issued for FGM. A court may only direct an interim care order to be made in, quote, family proceedings. And Section 8 of the 1989 Act, it defines what is meant by family proceedings for the purpose of the Act. It contains various statutes relating to domestic violence, forced marriage, and so on, but it does not include proceedings under the 2003 FGM Act. And the effect of this is that it is not open to a judge to issue an interim care order for FGM. Now, it's clearly an omission in law. I don't think this is deliberate, but it does mean that our courts don't have the full suite of powers that they need to protect girls who are at risk. And as Lord Berkeley pointed out when he introduced this bill in the other place, it means that while a family court can protect a girl at risk of forced marriage or domestic abuse, it cannot protect a girl at risk of FGM. And that needs to change. David Madison, who is the family lawyer who raised this issue with Lord Berkeley, has pointed out this isn't an academic or an abstract concern, it's a practical concern. There have been occasions when the police have sought an FGM protection order in the family court and the judge has wanted to employ the powers of the local authority in an order but has not been able to. This bill grants that power that has been missing. So all it does is it inserts proceedings for FGM protection orders from the 2003 FGM Act into the section of the Children Act which defines which family proceedings constitute grounds for an interim care order to be made. Well, to be clear, it inserts that part of the 2003 FGM Act which relates to FGM protection orders into Section 8 of the 1989 Children Act, and that makes FGM a family proceeding for the purpose of issuing care orders under the 1989 Act. I hope this House agrees that it is a simple and uncontentious change. If this bill passes, it's unlikely to lead to a huge number of new care orders being issued. They are rarely used, but it is important that judges have all the power we can give them to protect girls who are at risk, and at present that is simply not the case. Now, I have no doubt that when honourable members stand to speak, some will argue that this bill isn't enough to stop FGM entirely, and I'm not going to argue with that. They are right. We need better health support, mental health support particularly for survivors. We need better education so girls and boys grow up knowing that FGM is wrong. We need to get better at identifying at-risk girls, as they do better than we do in France. I do. Give way.
Tribute to the honourable gentleman who is making such a powerful speech about that, and he mentions the important role of education. It's of course education in the UK, but it's also education internationally, and on this Commonwealth Day will he pay tribute to the work of the Commonwealth and also DFID in ensuring that that education piece is really impacting worldwide?
I think, in fact, there's the very next point that I was going to make, and I thank him for his intervention. I've said this 2 times already, but I'm going to say it a 3rd time, because I am proud of the work that the Department for International Development does. It's a department that's often hammered by our newspapers, but it does really important work. And the £35 million that it's already spent has changed lives, it's saved lives, and the £50 million that's been committed will go on, if it's spent properly, and I'm sure it will go on to save lives as well. I mentioned Nimco's work. I don't want to embarrass her, but I know that the amount of money it took to get her to Somaliland to do the work she did was so small as to barely qualify as a DFID grant. I know that the work that Jaha, who I mentioned earlier, has done in Gambia has cost so little that it only would just register or qualify as a DFID grant. There are so many people like that out there who could do with the kind of support that DFID can provide. The Minister, my right honourable friend, provided lots of reassurances when she spoke in the committee stage about what the government is doing and how committed the government is to tackling FGM. I don't know whether the protocol means that she has the opportunity to repeat those reassurances later on in the course of this bill, and I look forward to. I saw her nodding her head. But if this bill, this tiny, uncontentious bill, protects just a handful of girls from undergoing the horror of FGM, then we will have done something worthwhile and important in passing it into law. So I want to close simply by thanking all members here, honourable members here, for their support, which I hope we'll get at the end of the day. I thank in particular the clerks, the Whip's office and the Ministry of Just Bill team who've been so helpful in getting us to this point. And finally, I want to thank Lord Berkeley again for winning the arguments next door and for handing us a bill in such good order. Thank you.